I begin today, and the topic is economic growth and development. The attempt is to formulate a series of ideas that will be useful to us in the weeks ahead. I make three sets of remarks. The first set concerns the basis for the takeoff of Europe from the Industrial Revolution onward, inaugurating a revolutionary period in the economic history of humanity. And that is the basis of all the experiences of growth that we will discuss subsequently. The second set of remarks is about the nature and content of the growth miracles, as they are often called, that took place after this initial takeoff. And the third set of remarks addresses the emerging debate about economic growth and development in the world right now. So first, the world's historical presuppositions of the experience of economic growth. Until the so-called Industrial Revolution in late 18th century Britain, economic growth in the world generally was both slow and, above all, constantly interrupted. The main protagonists in world history, especially in the vast Eurasian landmass, were the great agrarian bureaucratic empires. The Chinese, the Russian, the Mughal, the Byzantine, the Ottoman, the Safavid. In all of these empires, there was a characteristic recurrent problem that smothered the beginnings of accelerated economic growth and of a decentralized economy. There was the imperial center. Then there were the landholding magnates or grandees. And finally, the mass of tradespeople, workers, and peasants. The imperial rulers depended on success in imposing constraints on the landholding magnates so that they would not gobble up the land of the independent peasantry, and so that the state could have an independent base of taxes and of military recruitment. And there was a characteristic repertoire of strategies or policies by which the imperial rulers attempted to limit the greed and power impulse of these magnates. But they could not put themselves squarely on the side of the mass of working people, because that would arouse a tiger that they might be unable to ride, the tiger of a revolutionary despotism. So what we find in the history of these agrarian bureaucratic empires is that repeatedly, despite all efforts, the imperial center failed to constrain the landholding magnates, and that as a result of this failure, the empire fell apart into warring parts and then was invaded from outside, and the market order began to degenerate and to revert to a barter economy. Now, in Europe, this pattern was decisively and uniquely broken. And the breaking of the pattern had to do with the special conditions under which the Roman Empire in the West disintegrated. The formation of central states was delayed for many centuries, and when it finally occurred, it occurred in the form of a highly fragmented state system of smaller, medium-sized states at arms against one another and with space for the independent political and juridical personality of towns and commercial entrepôts. No one planned this development. It became the object of a doctrine only retrospectively, but it had decisive consequences. And we might label its generic consequence an irreversible level of economic, social, and cultural pluralism. The passing of that threshold of pluralism, beyond a point at which it did become irreversible, is one of the fundamental presuppositions of everything that happened afterward. Now, the second assumption of the European takeoff was the development of a special kind of natural science. This was a kind of natural science that, despite being empirically based, sought to develop an understanding of nature that went beyond our experience, our perceptual experience of the manifest world, and developed an understanding of the workings of nature that was often counterintuitive and astonishing. And the counterintuitive understanding of nature then always had to be translated back into the language of our perceptual experience. A second characteristic of this science that developed in the West is that its main object was insight into the transformations of nature. How it is that one state of affairs of nature turns into another, and how therefore we can use these transformations of nature to our own benefit. For example, the physics of phase transitions, the transformation of a solid into a liquid and then to a gas, underlies the invention of the early crucial devices of the Industrial Revolution, such as the combustion engine. And then later, for example, nuclear fission or fusion. The third presupposition of this European takeoff was technological innovation. The more powerful, the more it became perpetual, and the more it was internal or endogenous to the production system, as well as imported from outside of it. Now, we often think of technology as just a bunch of gadgets, but a more telling way to think about technology is to understand it as the materialization of a conduit, of a channel, between our experiments in the transformation of nature and our experiments in the transformation of our ways of cooperating with one another. And that connection is manifest in technology. Technological evolution presupposes both of the other presuppositions that I described. It is based on science, on a very particular kind of science, a science about the transformations of nature, and it depends on the opening of this space by social, economic, and cultural pluralism. Another way to think about technology is this. Everything that we have learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm. And whatever we can express formulaically, we can then embody in a mechanical contraption, the machine. So the machine allows us to go ahead into the space of what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Now, one implication of this view of the assumptions of the European takeoff is that there is a relation between technological revolution, or more broadly, economic revolution, and the organization of society. Technological and economic revolution depends on the background. This was the central insight of Karl Marx's theory of society and history. So in Marx's narrative, the development of the forces of production requires periodic revolution in the modes of production, that is to say, the organization of society and the economy. But this insight was limited or compromised in Marxist social theory by an illusion, or by a series of illusions. First, the illusion that there is a one-to-one relation between a particular level of technological or economic development and a particular organization of the economy. The truth is that any given technological innovation can be realized through a series of alternative or equivalent arrangements in society and the economy. And more generally, a series of deterministic illusions about the economy, that there was a closed list of possible economic regimes, the modes of production, that each of them was an indivisible system, and that there are laws governing their foreordained succession in history. Now, what is remarkable is that despite the absence of a one-to-one relation between the level of technological innovation or evolution and the organization of society and the economy, there are always alternative forms to achieve the same functional advantage. There seems to be a direction. And the direction is toward greater flexibility and plasticity. The ability to take advantage of the innovative potential depends on having our hands untied, on being able to trust one another to a higher extent, and sharing common purposes against the background of social and cultural difference. Let me give you a military example, because it's often easier to think about economic problems in a military context. At the end of the 18th century, there was a remarkable set of developments in artillery technology. And the armies of revolutionary and then Napoleonic France were able to exploit to the hilt the potential of this new artillery technology, because the artillery technology required that the forces be able to disperse themselves flexibly in the field in order to encircle and surprise. Combining the artillery with these flexible formations, the enemies of revolutionary and Napoleonic France were not able to exploit this advantage. They consisted largely in compact infantry battalions of resentful, conscripted peasants in tight formations. Soldiers with bayonets had to walk behind them so that they would not run away. And in these conditions, these enemies of revolutionary France were unable to exploit the operational potential of the new artillery. And some such connection between the ability to be plastic or flexible and the capacity to exploit fully the potential of the innovations is then a recurrent theme in economic history. Now I come to my second set of remarks. Let's consider the successful episodes of growth that took place after this initial takeoff of the late 18th century Industrial Revolution, the so-called growth miracles. That's a black box, so let's try to open the black box and look into it and see what are the persistent elements in these so-called growth miracles. And I want to call these elements the mobilization, the opening, and the shield. And for this purpose, I want to give as a historical example the experience of the United States in the first half of the 19th century, in the period between independence and the Civil War. So first, the mobilization. These growth miracles never happen spontaneously. They always require an elite, a national elite, to have a vision translated into a strategy. And a strategy that requires the large-scale mobilization of national resources. Physical, economic, financial, and human, to the end of developing new comparative advantage on the basis of existing comparative advantage. Now, in the United States, that was the project of Alexander Hamilton, the ideologist of American development in the first half of the 19th century. All the presidents of the United States, down through Abraham Lincoln, regarded themselves as disciples of Hamilton. And we could think of this project as a kind of war economy without a war. If we look at only one aspect of a war economy, which is massive mobilization of resources, there's another aspect which is radical institutional innovation under the pressure of war. So one element of this mobilization strategy was building the country, literally, through canals and railroads and roads. The physical construction of the country. The use of the national debt, the organization of the national debt as the financial basis for this mobilization strategy. The appeal to an overarching but selective protectionism to create a space in which the country could experiment and emerge, and the constitution of an agent. The agent was a clique of politicians, financiers, adventurers, diplomats, who allocated tasks among themselves and developed this mobilization strategy. Now, this strategy would not have achieved its goal if it had not interacted with a second element in the development of the United States. And that second element is what I want to call the opening. So we all know about the terrible incubus of African slavery. But in the two most important sectors of the American economy then, agriculture and finance, the Americans developed a selective democratization of the market order. They didn't simply regulate the market, and they didn't simply attenuate retrospectively the inequalities generated in the market by appealing to progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. They did a third thing, which is much more important. They innovated in the legal and institutional architecture of the market order. And they did that in these two most important sectors. In agriculture, a common belief of the leftists and the conservatives was that agrarian concentration was inevitable. an indispensable feature of so-called capitalism, repeating the experience of England and of other European societies. But the Americans rejected this. They distributed the land on the agrarian frontier, and they organized what in a contemporary vocabulary we would call strategic coordination between the government, both national and local, and the family farmers, to equip family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics, and to protect it against its unique vulnerability of combining economic risk with physical or climate risk. So agricultural insurance, price supports, food stockpiles, and the scientific or cognitive basis of agriculture in the land-grant colleges and in the system of agricultural extension. And then in the relation among the family farmers, they promoted what today we would call cooperative competition. They were independent entrepreneurs, but they shared resources and worked to achieve economies of scale. In finance, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, after a vast national conflict, they dissolved the Second National Bank of the United States. They prohibited for more than 100 years interstate banking, and they developed the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer that had ever existed in the world. When they did these things in agriculture and finance, they were innovating in the legal constitution of the market order. They were opening it up, giving more people more access to productive resources and opportunities in more ways. And some such development has happened in every successful growth miracle. Now, it has always happened under a powerful constraint. And the constraint is that the innovation is limited by the power of the entrenched interests. So it's as if the innovations are assimilated, the institutional as well as the technological innovations, in the form that least disturbs the entrenched interests. And this is what we could call the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance has an advantage, which is that it has reality on its side, the established interest, but it has a disadvantage, which is that characteristically it fails to exploit the full potential of the institutional or technological innovation. And that then is the opportunity for its enemies. Now, alongside the mobilization and the opening, there is a third element in these growth miracles. The third element is what I want to call the shield. The growth miracles happen in a world of armed and belligerent states, and they have to be protected. And this shield has three components. One component is military. There has, in all these growth miracles, been a successful alliance between the power of the armed state and the national economic experiment. The second element is commercial. The country must be able to engage in the world economy, but to engage on terms that are conducive to its own national experiment. So what is then vital is that in its way of integrating into the world economic order, the state must be able to enjoy the power of selectivity, to determine the terms under which capital can flow and trade can be open. Not unselectively, but selectively. So, for example, Northeast Asian so-called tiger economies in the second half of the 20th century, unlike the Latin American economies in the same historical period, limited the incursions of foreign capital. They took foreign loan capital, but they actively prevented foreign capital from penetrating and controlling the commanding heights of the production system. There is a third element in the shield. The third element in the shield is fiscal. The national rebels, these national elites, crafting these growth miracles, must be able to resist the blandishments and interests of the capital markets, of the financial interests, both domestic and foreign. And so they must force a heightening of the level of saving, both private and public, as the shield. Now, the contemporary context of this aspect of the shield is the following. When the nationalists and progressives in the world at large abandoned faith in Marxism, they generally took refuge in a vulgar Keynesianism and in an emphasis on counter-cyclical management of the economy. But this appeal to fiscal and monetary stimulus has to be subordinated to the imperative of the shield. There must be fiscal realism, but for the opposite reason of the pseudo-orthodoxy promoted by the financial interests. Fiscal realism not to win financial confidence, but so that the government and the country not be on their knees before the financial markets and be able to rebel. So in the short term, it may seem that the fiscal realism is the same, although it has these two different motives. But in the middle term, the practical consequences of this difference become manifest. Now, of course, the need to have this fiscal shield in the short term has a contractionary effect on economic growth. And this contractionary effect has to be neutralized through a power to promote public investment and to influence private investment. All of these growth miracles, I want to argue, had these three elements: the mobilization, the opening, and the shield. Now finally we come to the contemporary debate about economic development. In every historical period there is a most advanced practice of production. The most advanced practice of production is not necessarily at the outset the most efficient, the one that produces the most outputs with the fewest inputs. But it is the one that has the greatest potential to reach the frontier of productivity, to stay at it, and to inform and inspire the transformation of the surrounding economy. Up until recently, the productive vanguard, the most advanced practice of production, was what we call industrial mass production. The production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and in the context of very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. And the primacy of that economic vanguard took place in the context of a world division of labor in which capital-intensive production took place in the central economy and rudimentary production in the peripheral economies. Now we have the rise in the world of a new productive vanguard, which we will be exploring in the next 2 weeks of the course. The knowledge economy, dense in knowledge and science and technology, and devoted to permanent innovation. We shouldn't identify it simply with high technology industry or even advanced manufacture. It exists in the major economies of the world in every sector, in intellectually dense services and precision or scientific agriculture, as well as advanced manufacture. However, in every sector, it appears as an exclusive fringe, locking out the vast majority of businesses and workers. And this insular character of the new vanguardism becomes a motor of both economic stagnation and economic inequality. Now, the two greatest thinkers in the history of economics, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, both believed that the best way to study the workings of the economy and to explore its alternative futures is to study the most advanced practice of production in our epoch, because it is in that practice that our powers are most fully revealed. Now, in this context, then, we find emerging to the center of the world debate about development and growth a new dilemma. And this dilemma, the solution of this dilemma, then, becomes a condition for creating new growth miracles in the future. Repeating that experience, the elements of which I described before. So one horn of the dilemma is that the traditional shortcut to economic growth has stopped working. The message of classical development economics in the second half of the 20th century was that growth in the long term depends on the so-called fundamentals, education and institutions. In fact, in the age of industrial mass production, the educational and institutional requirements of economic growth focused on industrial production, on conventional industry, were very modest. Despite the lip service to education, a worker in a mass production factory basically only needed to have elementary literacy and numeracy so that he could understand instructions, basic physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination, and a disposition to obedience. Because in the mass production industry, he was asked to work as if he were one of his machines, formulaically. And the institutional requirements required only some semblance of a regulated market economy, which gave space for a planning bureaucracy. Those were the fundamentals. But in the short term, there was a shortcut, according to this view. The shortcut was to take workers and resources from the less productive sector and put them in the more productive sector. In practice, that meant taking them from agriculture and putting them in industry. Now that shortcut has stopped working all over the world. And one country after another is experiencing deindustrialization. Now, why has it stopped working? So the beginning of an explanation is that this old vanguard is no longer the vanguard. It's the leftover of an earlier vanguard, or it's the satellite of the new vanguard. The new vanguard discovers a way to transform part of the production process into routines or commodities and allocates them to firms and workers in other parts of the world where taxes and wages are low. So there's a race to the bottom in returns to labor and in taxes for the state. And increasingly, the new vanguard of the knowledge economy is able to outcompete the old vanguard, producing better and more cheaply what it used to make. But what's the alternative? The alternative would be a socially inclusive form of the new vanguard. But that alternative doesn't exist. The knowledge economy in all the major countries in the world exists only as a series of fringes, of islands. It is quarantined in narrow parts of the production system. And if it doesn't exist even in the richest economies with the most educated populations, how could it possibly exist in the rest of the world? That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma that increasingly has to be faced in the whole world. And it seems that if that dilemma can be broken, it can be broken only on its second side, by turning the seemingly impossible task of developing an inclusive form of the new vanguard into a feasible one, breaking it up into steps or into pieces. In confronting this problem, we face an enemy that is less obvious but more formidable than the entrenched interest: our lack of imagination.
Maybe we should just take some questions
Yes.
just for clarification on what you've just heard. Keep for the moment questions, comments on broader issues, but just for questions for clarification, just to make sure that.
Yes.
Could you offer a couple of examples, I guess concrete examples, of the fringes of the knowledge economy? Like what exactly you mean by that?
What do I mean by being a fringe?
Well, no, I mean, I guess I don't totally understand when you mean that across all the sectors there are these fringes.
So here's the thing about the knowledge economy. It's not, and we are going to explore this in the next 2 weeks. So it's not to be identified simply with high technology industry. So we use the term knowledge economy, we think of Silicon Valley. So that's only a fork, a corner of the knowledge economy, or the platform company. The knowledge economy is multi-sector. It exists in every part of the production system. And indeed, in the age of the knowledge economy, the distinctions among sectors are being attenuated, because advanced manufacturing consists in great part in crystallized intellectual services. However, although it is multi-sectoral, it exists in every part of the production system. In each part of the production system, it exists only as an island with a very small number of people. Now, it's not disseminating, it's not spreading. It seems, in fact, that exactly the opposite is happening in many parts of the world. The entrepreneurs and technologists who control the commanding heights of the knowledge economy are discovering a way to bifurcate the process of production into 2 parts. The creative part that they keep for themselves, like 100,000 people in California, and then the commoditized or routinized part that they subcontract to the old-style conventional industry, like, say, Foxconn in China. So that's what's happening. And you might think that the dissemination of an advanced practice of production and its deepening are 2 sides of the same thing. So insofar as it is cabined in these quarantined spaces, it doesn't reveal its full potential. It can reveal its full potential only as it spreads across many parts of the production system and includes more people. So if you think back to the second part of my argument before about the growth miracles, the content of what I call the opening now would have to include some project for reshaping the knowledge economy in inclusive form. Now, we don't have that. So it's very simple. The dilemma, it's not the essence of it should be very clear. The old mechanism of accelerated economic growth, conventional industrialization, has stopped working. But the alternative to it seems to be inaccessible. That's the problem. And so that problem then creates a block on the reinvention of those growth miracles under the new conditions, the conditions in which the advanced practice of production has changed. That's the idea.
So if I can just add to that just a couple of sentences, because I think it's critical to the discussion
Yeah.
we're having about what's the nature of the gaps, what do you mean between the vanguard and the fringe, and what's the nature of the
Yes.
discrimination. And I think it's the relevant divisions, I think they take a kind of an empirical or statistical form along different dimensions. And you can imagine there's one dimension which is within firms. There's one dimension that's sort of across firms. There's a dimension across the wage distribution of people who are actually working. And there's a spatial dimension also across successful metropolitan areas or successful urban centers and the lagging regions or smaller towns. So there's this gap that's opening up, and you can see visually, statistically, empirically across all of these. So within firms, it's the offshoring or outsourcing of the less value-creating parts of the production. Much of it happens globally through supply chains and global value chains, but also is happening obviously domestically in terms of, you can see the counterpart of the platforms and the gig economy coexisting simultaneously. You see it in the statistics across firms, which is something I mentioned in the first discussion, which is that within every narrowly defined industry, whether it's manufacturing or services, if you look at productivity performance between the leading firms and the lagging firms, that productivity performance is actually widening. The gap between the leaders and the laggards is growing. So that's sort of across firms within industries. You see it in terms of the winners and losers in the labor force. You look at the wage distribution in the labor force. Those who happen to be associated with forms of production either in metropolitan areas, more successful firms tend to be paid much better, even if they sort of are doing relatively low-skilled works. If you're associated with the center, you tend to get paid much better than if you're on the fringes. And finally, spatially, and I think across different urban areas, this is very, very visible between sort of what's happening in earnings, employment growth, productivity, knowledge generation in the United States, Boston, San Jose, and places like that, and many other areas that are sort of simply falling behind. So there are all these different empirical and
Of the same phenomenon.
Essentially, similar phenomena.
Yeah, and the middle part of the wage structure is being hollowed out.
So we'll talk about that
Yeah.
in later.
So there's an interesting corollary to this that should be mentioned. Conventional industry, so-called Fordist by allusion to Henry Ford, mass production had a special association with one sector of the economy, industry. Nevertheless, it had economy-wide influence. Every part of the economy was transformed on the model of industrial mass production, including agriculture. Now we have a new economic vanguard that in principle should be susceptible to even more rapid and universal dissemination, because it's not intrinsically associated with any one sector of the production system. But the opposite is happening. Instead of being universally disseminated, it's being cabined. Now, the beginning of an explanation is this. We can understand that industrial mass production, as I suggested in my remarks about the so-called fundamentals of institutions and education, has minimalist requirements. And it is stereotypical. It consists in a package of elementary machines and capabilities that are like a kit that can be put on an airplane and taken somewhere else. And the knowledge economy is not like that. Instead of having minimal requirements, it has maximal requirements. For example, of education, it requires a very particular kind of education. And it cannot be reduced to a simple repertoire of standard machines and capabilities. So that's the beginning of an explanation, but we're left with a problem. So it seems that we would be unable to repeat the formula of those growth miracles, especially with respect to the second crucial element that I call the opening, unless we resolve this dilemma.
Yeah, this clarification question, right, so far, yeah.
Yes.
Just to clarify a bit more, the problem that you're putting before us is one of figuring out how to make the knowledge economy more inclusive, or how to sort of find a different vanguard that's not the knowledge economy.
No, so it is now the most advanced practice of production. It represents, among other things, a bringing closer together of producing and imagining, of science and production, of the best firms and the best schools. It has vast potential, and we're going to explore this potential in different ways, but this potential is suppressed. So how are we going to achieve this potential? So, for example, you know that now in the United States there is a discourse that goes under the name secular stagnation, that attempts to make the slowdown in the rise of productivity look natural. And among other things, this discourse claims that the technological innovations of today have less potential than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. Now, it's baffling because how could any technology have more potential than artificial intelligence? So there's a much more straightforward explanation of economic stagnation, which is that the most productive practice is being denied to the vast majority of businesses and workers. So how could there not be slowdown? So that's on the economic side. But then it has as well far-reaching consequences for economic inequality. Under this system of the insular vanguard, a chasm deepens between the advanced and the backward parts of production. And then the dominant idea of the progressives, the institutionally conservative social democrats and social liberals of today, is that we'll attenuate this inequality after the fact by retrospective tax and transfer through progressive taxation and redistributed social spending. But the compensatory redistribution would have to be massive to make up for the inequalities that are anchored in the structure of the production system. And long before they reach the required dimension to fix the inequalities, they would begin to derange the economy, the established economic arrangements and incentives. So it seems that the only adequate solution is to deal with the structural problem structurally by fixing that chasm between the advanced and backward parts of production. So this argument goes in many different directions. But I do want to insist that this third set of remarks be seen in the light of the earlier two sets of remarks. So, with respect to the second set of remarks, it raises the question of what is the form that the opening, the democratization of opportunities and capabilities takes today, can take today. And with respect to the first set of remarks, in which I said that the world historical presupposition of this European takeoff was an irreversible pluralism, the question is, how can the dynamic of that pluralism be maintained and deepened in the conditions of this new paradigm of production? Yes,
So you just said that,
louder please.
you just said that the benefits of the vanguard are being denied to whole swath of the economy. Is that because the returns that could be gotten from extending the vanguard to these other sectors are zero or nil? Is it institutional? Is it political? Why is it that, as in the Fordist model, it hasn't spread to other sectors of the economy?
Well, that's a very large debate. So my view is that the spread,
Before you say more, can I just
yes,
piggyback on this
Yes.
question, because it's something I also wanted to ask
Yes.
you. I will ask the same question in a somewhat different form, and in the meantime, give you more time to think. How do we actually know that this is a divide that we can bridge? So let me just expand this a little bit, because I think this is an important part of the discussion. So we want to avoid institutional fetishism, and we want to avoid technological determinism. So avoiding institutional fetishism means that we have access to a wider repertoire of institutional arrangements that can support a market economy, and in our current technological trajectory, we want to open our imagination and think of different kinds of institutional arrangements, and hopefully we'll talk about some concrete instances of that. But we also want to avoid technological determinism in the sense that technology doesn't determine our institutions and the way our society is organized. So on these things we agree. The question is, how much flexibility do we really have on the other side? So it could be that we don't want to be institutional fetishists, but that doesn't mean that everything goes. We can, we should, experiment with all kinds of institutions. That there are some organizing principles that we should abide by. I'm not going to have time to talk about these things in my sort of prepared slides, which I'm not going to be presenting because I think this discussion is more interesting. But there's some discussion of that in my slides. It's on the course page, and you should look at it. So that goes to the question about sort of what are the boundaries of institutional experimentation, and let's say let's ensure that we have some of those bounds in our minds when we think about institutional experimentation. But the other point that's more germane to the current discussion about sort of institutional technological determinism, and it is true that technology doesn't determine our institutions and the way that our society organizes itself. But it's also true that there might be some limits to how much flexibility we have. And I think when you were in fact talking about the mass production society, you exemplified some of those, because you said that, well, here's kind of mass production technology essentially came with a kind of factory system and a particular way of organizing labor, and you didn't need that by skills, you need obedient, servile labor force, and could extend that once because everything was organized in terms of the factories. Then you could have labor being represented by labor unions. You could have this bargain between labor and capital that gave rise to the Treaty of Detroit in the United States, the welfare state in Europe. So So that sounds like that story has a kind of a nature of technological determinism, or at least suggests that there were some forms of social organization that went with that kind of technology. Now we come to today's knowledge economy. So what's the counterpart of that? Well, the knowledge economy, as we'll talk about much more in the next two sessions, is characterized by some features. For example, that is much more amenable to scale economies and network economies, which is that the benefits of being big are very large. That necessarily goes with a kind of a much more concentrated market structure. It suggests that, in fact, certain concentration of power, certain concentration of who the winners of the knowledge economy are going to be, is a much more natural outgrowth of this of the knowledge economy, given some of these technological features. To what extent can we actually break out of that? Now, I think there is a kind of thinking that's associated with the knowledge economy itself, which says this is an intrinsic characteristic of technology. There isn't that much you can do with it. In other words, this technology falls on the sky, society cannot shape the direction of technological change. We have to take as given the nature of this technology, and the only way you can address your questions about inclusion are through things that aren't really directly targeting the shape and direction of technological change in our production system. So what do? Well, we do things like universal basic income. So that's redistributing or give everybody some income. That's the only way you can deal with this. Or maybe you do job guarantees. You want a strong state. There you have a state gives everybody a guarantee of a job. If you think that simply having more income is not enough for fulfilling good life, you guarantee everybody a public sector job. Or you do it through the kind of compensatory transfers. You tax wealth. That's a big thing in the current policy discussion. Now that taxation is wealth, and that's what people get. So that's the alternative against which you have to argue your case. That in fact, that there is enough flexibility and plasticity in the kind of technological environment we're in, and that this is something that is feasible. But how do we know that it is? I mean, what would be the argument you would make to convince the skeptic that in fact that the current technology is one that is technologically immune to being reshaped directly in the direction of dissemination and greater inclusion, and that we need instruments that are outside the production and technological sphere?
So we already know that the knowledge economy is multi-sectoral, that it's present in every sector. It's not restricted to advanced manufacturing. We shouldn't identify it with the platform companies and their network effects. That's just one corner of the knowledge economy. And the business model of the platform companies depends on a series of legal and institutional presuppositions. I'll just give you one of several. A loophole in the law of intellectual property. They traffic in a resource, data generated by their customers or clients, for which they pay nothing. And this is very strange. But without that legal and intellectual presupposition, that presupposition in the law of intellectual property, their business model wouldn't work. So there's nothing natural about it. It's an artifact of the background arrangements. Now, the question is, how far can this vanguardism, this productive vanguardism, extend outward from the island in which it now flourishes? Of course, we don't know the answer to that question. That's an experimental question. But we have reason to think that part of the answer to that question depends on these exigent conditions for the flourishing of the knowledge economy. That's why it's unlike mass production. It does depend on a host of conditions. to flourish outside the vanguards in which it now flourishes, these background conditions have to be fulfilled. For example, one of them is a certain kind of education focused on analytic capabilities rather than on the mastery of information, and promoted by a dialectical teaching, a contrast of points of view. Another is the accumulation of social capital, because it demands the knowledge economy, a revolution in the moral culture of production, a higher level of discretion and reciprocal trust than the command and control structure of conventional industry. So how is social capital generated? By arrangements that lead different people with different characteristics, to do many things together. But most importantly, it depends on legal and institutional innovations. Those innovations can begin modestly in opening access to the resources and opportunities of advanced production in favor of the backward parts of the production system. But then they evolve to the much more radical development of alternative mechanisms of economic decentralization. In other words, alternative regimes of property and contract. So remember what the structure of these economies now is in the most simple terms. There are these islands of advanced production. Then there's the declining mass production industries. The industrial policy of the progressives and of the right-wing populists now in the North Atlantic world consists basically in buying a few more years for these declining mass production industries. And then there's a vast economic periphery. Most people are employed in shops, in small-scale enterprises that are technologically retrograde and retrograde in their practices of production. That's the situation of the economy. So the question is, how far can this locomotive, can this advanced practice of production penetrate, transform the character of the mass production industries, and lift up part of the vast economic periphery? We don't know. But there's no reason to think that the present situation of extreme insularity and confinement is natural and necessary. A much better way to understand it is to say that this present form of the knowledge economy is a contemporary example of what I call the path of least resistance. There's a set of organizational, conceptual, and technological innovations. The innovations are then adopted in the form least disturbing to the ruling interests and established preconceptions. And that's the form of this insular knowledge economy.
Can I just follow up on my question?
Sure.
So people like Larry Summers, who talk about structural stagnation,
Yes.
say that
Secular
stagnation,
Yeah.
sorry, argue that it's the very fact that this vanguard economy has permeated many sectors that has created this secular stagnation. You have ATM machines, you don't need as many tellers. You have Amazon, therefore you don't need a lot of bricks and mortar types of infrastructure. And so this is very technology, and how much it has permeated the economy is in fact the cause of this secular stagnation.
So that's another big debate, right? The debate about automation and the substitution of labor. And there the argument is there simply a cumulative process of displacement of labor, or does the destruction of some jobs, their replacement by machines, then create the opportunity for other jobs, which are non-repetitious or non-formulaic? And in that argument, I would want to take the hopeful position that they doesn't create these other jobs automatically, but only under certain conditions. which are the educational, social, moral, and legal institutional conditions for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. But you know, if you don't believe in this position, if this position seems to you unpromising, you're still left with the dilemma that I described. What are you going to do? The conventional shortcut to economic growth doesn't work anymore. What's the alternative to it? That's the focus of the debate. And unless you can solve that dilemma, how can you keep repeating the growth miracle? So that's the issue that's before us. Whether or not you accept the transformative thesis of the inclusive knowledge economy. Yes.
I want to follow up on the first question. So, in your answer, you mentioned Foxconn, which is linked to the whole Silicon Valley group.
Yes.
But you also said it's not only about Silicon Valley, it's not about the FANG, Facebook, Google, Amazon, everyone. But could you just give like one or two names of companies in the agricultural sector, industrial sector, and service sector that you see as part of this vanguard? Just like one or two names of each sector.
Well, you know, many. It's hard to distinguish between manufacturing and services. For example, a cloud company that's focused on software rather than on hardware is essentially services, and that's what's happening in many parts of the economy. In agriculture, the distinction between so-called natural foods and synthetic foods is being effaced. And more scientific or precision agriculture is a creature of science, and with high value added. And at the limit, this effacement of the distinction between what's natural and what's synthetic, and so forth. So it's not restricted to any part of the production system. It's the triumph of the mind over something that we just get from the ground, or that we do just by repeating the formulaic activities of machines. Now, the question is, how are we to take control of this process and to guide it? It doesn't happen spontaneously. So what I don't want is for my thesis to be interpreted as a kind of techno-optimism, as if there were some natural process of evolution and we can just sit back and watch it. On the contrary, what I believe is that if we do nothing, what tends to prevail is what I described as the path of least resistance. This hyper-insularity of the knowledge economy, the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to precarious employment, the race to the bottom in the rest of the world in the non-knowledge economy, and the largely frustrated or even futile attempt to compensate for the resulting inequalities by retrospective tax and transfer. That's what we have in the world right now. And so the question is whether that's the only thing that we can have.
Could you just give some examples of names?
Of what?
Where do you see the vanguard? Like, could you make it specific?
Well, what do you mean, names of companies? I would be, I would be reluctant to do that. Every so in agriculture, it's strange for me to begin naming companies, but okay. So take
What's the source
Monsanto.
of
Yeah.
Is it that there aren't? I mean, I don't.
No, I think there are.
I
I just
want
want
to understand where the question is coming from.
I just want to make sure I have the right conception of
No,
the
I mean,
vanguard, because it's a very broad concept.
so in agriculture, going all the way from advanced plant science to a company like Beyond Meat, you have technological and scientific revolution in agriculture. In intellectual services, there are a bunch of companies, Salesforce, Nutanix, whatever, that are crossing the divide from hardware to advanced software and intellectual services. That's the locomotive of the economy. That's what's revolutionizing the economy. In terms of profits, that's where a large part of the gains are now concentrated in the stock markets of the North Atlantic countries. It's not complicated to know what these places are. The problem is that it's like an archipelago of islands, of fringes. And the vast majority of people and of firms are locked out of this business. Yes.
So, to me, it seems like if we were to write an economic model with private property and increasing returns to scale in certain factors, we would inevitably end up with sort of economic power concentrated in the hands of the few. We've had this with monopolists in the past, natural monopolies in the past. What I think your argument is saying is that right now technology's dissemination is a lot easier.
Yes.
And we are somehow unable to convince the existing vanguard to let the mass majority of workers have access to this, which would be, because there could be two things. It could be the case that they have private returns that are increasing, that have increasing returns to scale in the endowment that they have, or it's just that they don't realize that the alternative that you're proposing would be better. So if we have ideas versus interests, and if this is a question of lack of imagination, how can we convince existing entrenched interests that the alternative would be beneficial for them too, if that is the case?
We can't convince them. It's called politics. We don't go on our knees to Silicon Valley and say, please participate in this revolutionary transformation. We attempt to achieve power in the state and in the academy, to change the ideas that guide the world and to win power. So if the technological and entrepreneurial elite in Silicon Valley looks around and says, why isn't the rest of the country like us? And then they come up with some simple-minded solution like education is not good enough, but nothing that would challenge the legal and institutional basis for their rents.
So, if I may follow up though,
Yeah.
in case of a competitive political economy, then what you're saying is essentially still competitive, that it is a question of sort of gathering the power of the people through democratic mobilization, that like democracy is the instrument of the many. So it's not a question of better ideas will convince the entrenched elites. The lack of imagination is then about us not having the right strategy to do so.
Well, it's still necessary to have ideas. So, the general situation of the progressives now in the world is that they pretend to be concealing, for tactical reasons, a plan that they in fact don't have. And the only way in which you can have a plan is by developing it collectively. So you have to have a project. So in these growth miracles that no one is talking about, we're focusing just on the third set of remarks. And in these growth miracles that I described in the second set of remarks, there was always a national elite, a struggle within the national elite. Some faction takes control, like the faction that took control in Japan at the time of the Meiji Restoration. And then they have a strategy, which requires a reshaping of things. And in that context, they then have to do this selective opening. And then there's a struggle between how much opening, how much sacrifice of the entrenched interests. Are the entrenched interests willing to give up something in order to keep what's most essential for themselves, and so forth. And then there has to be the shield. And so I don't think that the fundamental elements that I described as essential to those growth miracles have been superseded. We still need each of those elements. It's just that the context and content is different given this new situation of the dominant paradigm of production. So there has to be a project. But what's the project? Look, go back to this. What's the industrial policy, or much more generally, what's the economic growth strategy of the dominant political forces now in the North Atlantic world? In the United States, the basic growth strategy is simply cheap money. allocated to the central bank, to the Federal Reserve. The progressives in the United States have no progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. All they have is an approach to the demand or the consumption side. So they're stuck in this kind of shrunken Keynesianism. And rather than proposing a way of deepening and disseminating the knowledge economy, they want to buy a few more years for the declining mass production industries of the Rust Belt. Constraints on plant closing, subsidies, and so forth. They all know that that won't work, but it's as if, well, the problem will be beyond their own lifetime. So that's the context. And it seems to me that regardless of all skepticism about the potential for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy, the problem remains. How can there be a successful national project in the absence of a productivist agenda, of a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy? That's the real debate. And this debate about the inclusive form of the knowledge economy is simply a variant on it. Yes?
So, in order to support inclusive vanguardism, you mentioned that there needs to be kind of capability for that.
There needs to be?
Like a capability in terms of education,
Yes.
presumably in terms of institutions that can help govern this experimental forms of productive capacity. Do those capabilities require a certain level of economic development? And if so, given that earlier on in your set of remarks you mentioned that the classical model of achieving economic growth is hampered, how can countries achieve that level of economic development needed for inclusive vanguardism?
Well, so
I'm going to piggyback on this one as well, because I think this has been in the past one of our favorite debates, and so I think it's useful to dwell on this a little bit. You mentioned as preconditions three things. One was a certain kind of education. Second was, and I think the question is referring about that part as well, in particular. Then you said that we needed accumulation of social capital, increase of social cooperation and trust, and then third, we needed legal and institutional innovations. So one criticism of this, and I think was implicit, although it was much more nicely and diplomatically put, is that, well, these are as much outcomes as they are preconditions.
Yes.
So if we achieve these things, who cares about the inclusive vanguardism in the first place? Because those are all nice things we've already achieved meaningful outcomes. So the question really is how do we get there, and what are the sort of stepping stones, and what is this kind of strategy? So I think, and that also relates to your answer to the previous question with regard to the politics of how we get there. And there the question is, we can dismiss the current political debate as not being particularly helpful, but in order to make a convincing case that there is a path, that we must at least be able to identify certain existing practices, certain existing items, certain existing kernels of political coalitions that are stepping stones towards this strategy. So the question is sort of what what are some existing practices or political coalitions or existing signs that on which we could build. So you could, for example, say, well, in terms of this productivist policy, there are actually sort of glimmers of hope, because in the actual practices of the advanced democracies, there are already certain things that are happening on which one could append or combine and build these kinds of things. It's not, you describe the United States as an economy where the elites or the progressive elites are purely focused on redistribution. distribution or on or expanding the economy through cheap money. But in the background, there's a lot of discussion about rebuilding labor market institutions through changing the rules of bargaining between labor and capital, through a kind of new regulatory institutions that are going to set floors on labor standards for the gig economy. There are all kinds of ongoing practices, underneath the things that are politically salient, such as the kind of regional manufacturing institutes, the practices of ARPA, Advanced Research
Yes.
Projects Administration, that Trump has talked about disbanding, but still goes on. In Europe, you have European Green Deal, which is sort of could be a massive opportunity for generation investment in new technologies and a more inclusive plan. So is it possible to point to existing things as
Yes.
kernels on which one, so that we can start making a connection
Yes.
between these larger ideas and ultimate objectives to things that are actually
Yes.
sort of already
Yes.
exist.
So first, let me say, I'm not thinking about this problem as a Marxist would think about it, as if it were a system in which all of the pieces fit together, and we either do everything or we do nothing. We either have a reformist management of the existing system, or we have a completely different system. That's not how it is. There are these different conditions, and they're connected, but the process of transformation is a process of combined and uneven change, which we advance along a certain front, and then we hit a limit, and we find we can only advance further if we can advance on other fronts. So the way I think of it is there are these conditions, the educational, the social moral, and the legal institutional. Then you can ask, under what conditions is a society more or less likely to be able to satisfy those conditions? This is the background requirements in culture and in politics. A radicalization of experimentalism in culture and a high-energy democracy, a series of political innovations that make change in politics less dependent on crisis.
You're not just adding on to
No,
it.
but let me say that it is true that these requirements and these background conditions have a value that transcends their use for the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. So they're connected. It's not as if we had to satisfy all of the conditions before we began to move at all. It's that we begin to move in a certain space, and then we discover that we can't move more until we change other things. So, for example, let's take a little piece of this about which we haven't spoken yet, which is the condition of labor. You mentioned it a moment ago. So, under this system of the insular vanguardism, an increasing part of the labor force is abandoned to radical economic insecurity through precarious employment, insecure wage labor disguised as pseudo self-employment. And we know from economic history that it's very hard to sustain a dynamic of inclusive productivity growth in the context of a depression in returns to labor. So we would have to promote a new set of labor laws to represent, organize, and protect those precarious employees. For example, assuring a principle of price neutrality in the remuneration of temporary or precarious work in comparison to the equivalent form of labor rendered under conditions of stable employment. And those things go together. But it's not as if it were a system in which we do everything or do nothing. Now, then you ask about what are the prompts in American experience today that might set us in the direction of such experiments? Well, there's a natural pedagogy of disillusionment. So, many of the governors in the United States, including the Republican governors, have the project in recent decades of wanting to have their own Silicon Valley. So they did it in the form of establishing an industrial park or a set of incubators, like a little Potemkin village. It was a preposterous idea, and of course it's failed all over because it's a thinking of the knowledge economy as if it were mass production. It's like a portable kit that you can transform from one place to another. It's like a little prop without fulfilling any of the conditions. So that hasn't worked. But then the fact that it hasn't worked becomes a provocation to the next step, which would be a little less primitive. So let's now invent an equivalent in 21st century conditions of the 19th century system of agricultural extension, so that there would be an organization by local and national governments of access to advanced practice and technology that would begin to lift up part of that vast periphery stuck in retrograde small and medium-sized business. Well, the Americans did it before. Why can't they do it again? And so forth. So it seems to me that's the kind of context in which this would arise. The earlier simplified response didn't work. Now let's try the next thing. And the next thing inspired by prior historical experience.
But that's actually something that's already happened.
Yes, that's already happening. So it is in fact then taking advantage of a dynamic that is already underway and imagining it as part of this larger movement.
So just to be clear, what we're talking about here is a disillusionment with the very widespread practice of states in the U.S. or in fact either subnational entities or national entities in the rest of the world to try to attract good jobs and new technologies through essentially a very sort of investment subsidies, right? You think about subsidy to the sort of competition that Amazon ran with cities for their second headquarters, or the subsidy that the state of Wisconsin gave to Foxconn to attract. That has been sort of like an established mode of state action to attract high technology or productive employment. And I think it's now increasingly understood, as in fact the Amazon and Foxconn examples amply illustrate, that these strategies either don't work because firms essentially use these kinds of investment subsidies as a way of skimming public resources and playing different subnational entities and states against each other, or even when they work, they create, they're very, very expensive in the sense that they create very few jobs or very little technology spillovers for the amount of money that they cost. And third, they're very brittle because of in this domain with highly uncertain technology. It's very difficult to write down and enforce contracts ex ante that's going to respond to ex post changes in economic and technological conditions, which either firms would be willing to be part of or won't be too expensive for the states to actually offer. So that model of investment incentives, and the latest of that, by the way, is Trump's program of opportunity zones, which many of you may have heard, which is essentially a way of just subsidizing inward investment to areas with little employment. But they're essentially just basically saying, here's a huge subsidy, huge tax break to any investor that's going to come in. Instead of that, what we're talking about is taking a cue from American history. You mentioned agricultural extension, which was a kind of delivery of services, highly customized services by state agencies and a package of services to get existing producers and newcomers to get them up to speed and develop them with new technological opportunities. The extension of that, the analog of that today is often called manufacturing extension. And that's actually something that is already being used in a number of different parts of the country, where instead of simply saying we're going to provide any investor with an investment subsidy or a tax break, it's based on a much more collaborative pattern of cooperation between a local development agency or a state agency with existing producers or prospective investors to figure out what their needs are, to figure out what kind of skills are required, to figure out what kind of market or technological assistance that they might need. So it's based much more on a kind of a provision of customized services that's based on a collaborative
Yes.
and iterative model.
Yes.
I said sort of a different kind of strategy of promotion that you could think goes way beyond in manufacturing. It could be extended in a number of different areas. It's this kind of thing that we probably would want to
And in the
talk about.
19th century was combined with the fundamental innovation of the land-grant colleges, which established the educational basis of 19th century agriculture.
So what's different in this is that it's a very different model of how you think about how technology develops and how the role of the state and other public institutions, because it's a much more instead of thinking about a traditional dichotomy between the state and the market, and the state simply sets kind of a bunch of base fundamental rules and laws, and then investors and the market just go through
Absolutely.
and their thing. There's a process of co-evolution, that the rules are evolving because a lot of the things that need to be developed, including the technologies themselves, are ex ante uncertain. So there's a process of iterative co-evolution of the rules and the disciplines, and it's
With the arrangements that define the market.
with the arrangements that define the market. And so much of the legal setting for this, of course, is missing. It's not there. So that's part of the reason why it's operating way below the radar screen, because in some sense it has not been
So for example,
nationalized. The part, sorry, one more point. The part that has been nationalized at the federal level in the United States is the very the high technology sector of this. But the high technology layer of this is not concerned with dissemination. It's not concerned with sort of backward integration. It's not concerned about generating jobs. When you look about sort of how high technology is stimulated or sponsored in the United States, is through R&D subsidies to innovators, or is through highly specialized programs that either DARPA or RDE, these federal agencies under the Department of Defense or Department of Energy, run. They're focusing on the development of frontier technologies, one with sort of defense type applications, the other with more green technologies and environmental applications, but not with this focus on sort of disseminating technologies per se. I think that's sort of what's missing in that.
so implicit in that is a methodological point, which I think is of immense importance, and which did come up in my remarks, but I want to emphasize it because it's a continuing theme. There are three things you can do with a market order. The first is you can regulate it. The second is you can attenuate its inequalities after the fact by compensatory redistribution through taxes, progressive taxation, and social spending. The third thing is the most important. You can reshape what the market order is, its legal and institutional architecture. And that then defines the primary distribution of economic advantage, as opposed to compensating, correcting after the fact for the distribution of advantage. That's much more powerful and far-reaching. And that's the connection between the debate about inequality and the debate about productive inclusion. Now, just to give one more step of content to this idea of the points of departure. The transformation of the legal and institutional architecture is to some extent already happening in a piecemeal form, undertaken by the economic agents themselves. So in the middle of the 20th century, the rise of the regulatory and redistributive state, a new body of public law was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. But the knowledge economy, among other things, requires innovation in the basic structure of private law. For example, in the law of contracts. So the knowledge economy depends on a very heavy level of cooperative competition. And that means, for example, in the biotech industry, that firms have to be able to cooperate in projects. Their cooperation in projects is not organized under the form of standard contract, the bilateral executory promise, a promise to exchange performances at some defined moment in the future that is exhausted at the moment of performance. It's an incomplete, ongoing, relational, contractual arrangement in which the main object of the contractual arrangement is the relationship itself. And all of the performances are partial achievements of the relation, not fully bargained out, and therefore even invalid under the terms of standard contract law. So the economic agents are, in some spontaneous form, under the guidance of their own narrow corporate interests, already innovating in the structure of private law, but not for the purpose of this larger project of reshaping the market economy. So if we were to examine in detail what's happening, we would find many, many examples of these fragmentary experiments that offer then the natural points of departure for a bolder project of transformation.
So these points of departures and seeds or nuggets of
Yeah.
these economic or institutional and legal evolution exists, but they have not become part of a kind of a national strategy or
Of either a political program or an intellectual project.
So a similar question can be asked then of whether there are seeds of sort of these the political champions or the political elites that will push forward this agenda. So the question I want to ask you is whether you see the similar kinds of seeds or points of departure in the existing political systems, or not. And another question is whether you see, all the examples that you've discussed before, historically, have been examples of rather authoritarian systems or systems that were, even in the case of the United States, were of course highly exclusionism, based on significant authority on the part of the very narrow elite.
Yeah.
The question is their compatibility with the kind of political democracies as they exist currently.
Well, that's real history, right? So all the societies that have existed in the world are class societies. All the democracies that exist in the world are weak democracies. So think back to my 19th century American example of the first half of the 19th century. What was fundamental was the combination of this mobilization on top, Hamilton's project, with the selective democratization below. The mobilization on top would not have achieved its effect unless it were interacting with the democratization below. But why was this virtuous combination then weakened in subsequent episodes of American history. That's one way of addressing the question you just posed. It seems it was weakened by the combination of two prejudicial forces. So, one force was political, and you invoked it just now. The Americans established a proto-democratic liberalism in their democracy, not a full democracy. And their constitutional arrangements combine a liberal principle of fragmentation of power with a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And they think, mistakenly, that these two principles are naturally and necessarily combined. They're combined by intention or by design. And so the weakness of democracy was then one of the forces inhibiting the continuation of this interaction between the mobilization above and the democratization below. A second was the intellectual force of the naturalization of the private order in particular, and of the institutions in general. So the Americans believed that they had discovered at the time of the foundation of their republic the definitive form of a free society. And all the other countries in the world would either have to subscribe to this formula or to continue to languish in poverty and despotism. Well, that's only a modest exaggeration of what they continue to believe. And so there's this institutional idolatry. And it's not only the object of the public religion, but of the social sciences and the policy discourse cultivated at places like Harvard University, where you know there's a relentless campaign against institutional imagination. You see it all around you. And severing this link between insight into the actual and imagination of the vital possible, of the adjacent possible. So it's that combination of the intellectual constraint and the political constraint which is decisive in suppressing the transformative opportunities. Well, if you've gotten that far in your understanding, then you're halfway there, because you then begin to have a different imagination of the possibilities.
Comments, discussion?
When you
So I feel like when we mostly talked about the institutional innovations, legal innovations that need to occur, and political change as well, it's mostly been at the domestic level. I think it's mostly been at the domestic level we've been talking about. And I wanted to ask, to what degree do we need international coordination as we're making these changes? So for example, I'm just thinking about institutional innovations that would occur to improve the diffusion of technologies across society. So something like mandatory licensing of patents. But if you had that in the US, then the firms might just go elsewhere. So how much does this have to happen all at once everywhere versus in one country at different times?
Well, this is the object of one of our classes in the future. And we're going to come to this debate about globalization. But
But I would say, I think in large part, I think we would agree that most of what we're talking about are things that could be done at the national level or subnational
Yes.
level even,
yes,
without significant international cooperation.
Yes, but the
there
question-
there are examples otherwise would be interesting to discuss.
yes, but the question is whether the international order will reinforce or suppress this opportunity for national experimentation. And I do want to argue that the dominant direction of globalization, as manifest in the world trade regime, is one that tends to suppress rather than to reinforce national experimentation. It does that, for example, by requiring that the participants in the trade regime, organized under the WTO treaties or under the multilateral trade agreements, subscribe not just to the market economy, but to a very particular version of the market economy. So, for example, it must be a version that prohibits, under the label subsidies, all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich used to become rich, and that are essential to some of these things we're talking about just now. It wants to incorporate into the rules of world trade the odious regime of intellectual property developed at the end of the 19th century that leaves many of the technological innovations of greatest importance to humanity in the hands of a small group of multinational businesses, and so forth. So we would want an institutional and legal minimalism, the maximum of openness with the minimum of restraints on these national institutional experiments. Now, as a practical matter, the redirection of this global order is not going to happen as the gift of a cosmopolitan elite to the nations below. It's only going to happen if there's a struggle. And the struggle has to be motivated by strong national projects down below that hit against the limits of this present style of globalization, and that force then a change in the direction of globalization. That's the kind of connection that I envision.
How does access to capital interact with the knowledge economy? Just because I realize, how does access to capital? Just because I realize that, for example, one example of Europe, you have about like 6.5 billion, like, I don't know, investments by venture capital firms, startups. Well, in the United States, you have 40 billion. And I imagine in the rest of the world is even like much less than Europe.
Much less.
Right, so then,
Much less.
even if you do have access to this knowledge, how do you still build up this knowledge and then utilize it?
So access to capital is fundamental, of course, to this uplift of production, but it means very little unless it's combined with other things, right? Capital by itself means almost nothing. Capital together with these other things means a great deal. Now, in principle, you might think that the most important responsibility of finance in an advanced economy is to help fund the production of new assets in new ways, which is what venture capital does. In fact, venture capital, even in the United States, where it is most established, is a minuscule part of the activity of the capital markets. So, and we're going to come to this debate. It's one of our themes later on in the course, the relation of finance to the real economy. In all the existing market economies, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Well, what's the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's theoretically to finance the productive agenda of society, but in fact it has only an oblique and episodic relation to that productive agenda. So then we have the problem of a way of thinking, because under the dominant way of thinking, if there's an issue in the misallocation of capital, it must be because there's some localized defect in competition or in symmetry of information, or else some localized defect in the regulatory response to the localized defect in competition. What's excluded by that way of thinking is that different arrangements can either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy and make it less dangerous, make finance less dangerous by making it more useful. And so this project of deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy has, on one side, as a counterpart, a change in the relation of labor to capital, and on another side, a change in the relation of finance to the real economy. And in each of those three departments, innovation in the legal constitution of the market order. So it's that third thing that we can do about markets, not just to regulate them or attenuate them after the fact, but to change them.
And I think one of the most important points that we made, I think, is that it's possible to conceive of this as a sequence of gradual moves that are
Yes. Absolutely.
But talking about the more significant institutional restructuring should not paralyze us into
Absolutely.
thinking that it's either all or nothing. And I think one of the most important resources we have in this path is existing practices that are already going on, that are often
Absolutely.
hidden behind or beneath the radar. And I think as a practical matter, what I find most promising or encouraging is the search for these often subnational experiments that are going on in this
And let me just,
and that's a very important resource as we think about these
Yeah.
things, we think about these grand ideas. What are some of the local counterparts,
Yeah.
local practices that go with this?
and let me just emphasize that point. Because of the influence of theories like Marxism, classical social theories, we associate fundamental change with systemic revolutionary change. And gradual or fragmentary change with superficial change. But in fact, almost all the real structural change that happens in the world is fragmentary. And it can be revolutionary in its outcome, even though it is piece by piece and step by step, if it persists in a certain direction under an idea.
Okay, next week we have a special